Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the broadcast so I can stay on the airwaves. The best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year. We do private weekly group Zoom chats to shoot the breeze on current events. I do a weekly roundup of the news and commentary that people are very much enjoying, and sometimes we bring back past podcast guests to do a live Q&A with listeners. You can also donate, buy me a coffee, send some pesos through DonorBox or Wise, purchase a consult if you want to chat with me. And this month's sponsor is Mikkel Thorup's Expat Money Summit, which is going to be happening soon. It's for free, entirely online from October 7th to the 11th, where they'll be talking about internationalization with the headline speakers being mostly having been guests of this podcast, Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horchin, Mark Faber, and others. And basically, it's about crafting your perfect plan B, getting your second or third passport, and so forth. The link is in the description, so you do have to register, expatmoneysummit.com. Joining us is Ned Ryun, who's the founder and CEO of American Majority and Voter Gravity. He's the son of former Congressman, Olympian, and Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient Jim Ryun, and his most recent and excellent book is American Leviathan, The Birth of the Administrative State and Progressive Authoritarianism. I've got the Kindle ebook version right here. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Ned.
Yeah, no, great to be with you.
I've had a number of guests who've written books on this theme, and I was just telling you before I hit record, I think yours is one of the ones I preferred because it's short and sweet, and it's a smooth read. And this is unfortunately one of my favorite topics: the administrative state, the managerial state, the technocracy. And you write in your book, it's fever dreams of utopia and the perfection of man on earth. You write that progressive statism with its administrative state was going to obstruct access to government and make it more distant, less accessible, and less accountable, and in doing so undermine the very idea of representative democracy. And you say that progressive statists want an oligarchy of an expert class unhindered by a constitution. And basically, that's what we have today. Yes. So tell us about the book.
So this is something that I have been thinking about for a few years, but really what triggered eventually me getting to this point of actually writing this book was I was on the sets of MSNBC and CNN a lot the spring and summer of 2017. Sadly, they don't seem to want me anymore. And it struck me they actually believed this Russian collusion hoax was real, and really started to kind of think through this and realized it had nothing to do with Russian collusion. Quite frankly, everything that followed Ukrainian quid pro quo, the lawfare being targeting Donald J. Trump has nothing to do with any of that at all. It has everything to do with who decides. And Donald J. Trump showed up in January of 2017 in D.C. as the duly elected president of the United States and essentially declared, I'm the one who decides. Right? I decide domestic and foreign policy in many ways. And in response to that, the administrative state actors said, we don't think so. We think we're the ones that decide. And for having the temerity to say, I'm the one who's the duly elected, president of the United States, I'm the one who decides, they treated him as a traitor to his country. And I've even told Trump this. I've told him in person. We had a conversation about this summer of 22, in which I said, it really comes down to who decides. And they deeply resent the fact that you think you decide, and even more so that you reject the premise that the administrative state in any way is legitimate, because it's not. It's deeply unconstitutional. So I wanted to take people back, use that as kind of a hook. That's kind of the opening part of my book, and then take them back to the beginning where the progressive movement started in America in late 1800s, early 1900s, really with the idea of rejecting the moral and political authority of the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, and then even more so destroying the machinery of the Republic, which I think I use that very intentionally. People think that the greatest defender of our natural inherent rights is some enumerated Bill of Rights. It is not. The greatest defender of natural inherent rights is the diffusion of power. And I say that because once power becomes consolidated, it becomes a threat to natural inherent rights. And the reason I put in the subtitle, The Birth of the Administrative State and Progressive Authoritarianism, when you have unaccountable consolidated power, it eventually becomes authoritarian. And that was the whole point with progressives in the beginning. The only separation that they were interested in was separating out an administrative state, this massive bureaucracy, and filling it with what they perceived to be an educated elite who, through applied science, would somehow lead the American people to greater progress and literally perfection of mankind in the here and now. Well, what you eventually end up with is unrepresentative form of government that becomes consolidated. And instead of representing the interests of the American people or having any accountability to the American people, it really becomes almost a feudal situation in which this oligarchy demands of the dirty little peasants, you will do this because we are your betters. The enlightened state in their minds is salvation. We're only trying to bring you salvation. Why can't you understand that? And so the state becomes this invasive every aspect of life until all of life, all of society is saved. And that's why you just see this perpetual growth of government, perpetual spending, and the perpetual invasion into all aspects of our lives, because it's part of the DNA of the administrative state.
And you write in your book, I mean, there's so many things I very much agree with in your book. You say Americans shouldn't be amazed at the regulatory excesses they face today, whether over gas stoves or fossil fuels or water usage or vaccine mandates or every other issue that supposed elites are attempting to compel change on. What should surprise us is that this hasn't happened sooner in the rise of the administrative state, because this authoritarianism in every aspect of life is exactly the point. You say the truly amazing part about all of this is that there wasn't a total collapse of freedom years ago. You know, I permanently expatriated from the U.S. in the early 2000s. And, 20 years ago, I was using the term the United Soviet States of America, instead of USA, the USSA. And, here we are. You mentioned in your book, you talk about the DHS, the Ministry of Truth. I mean, I'm still amazed that little old me, an average American from Chicago, from Illinois, living in Mexico now, when the DHS rolled out the Disinformation Governance Board, I was one of the few people hit. I was permanently banned from PayPal, which is political persecution. The DHS, says it's the Ministry of Truth, and so it's incredible. Thoughts on that, and then if you want to comment. We don't have to spend too much time on that. People can get the book, but you talk about as well. This has been a long time coming, the four horsemen of the progressive apocalypse and so forth.
So you eventually get to, so people want to know, where did this progressive mindset come from? And I'll just give a very short, I write about this a little bit in the book, but a very concise history of it. A lot of those seeking advanced degrees couldn't find them in the U.S. because we didn't have the university and college system that we have today. And this is in the post-Civil War, late 1800s. So they had to go overseas. They had to go to France. They had to go to Prussia, obviously now Germany. Especially in Prussia, a lot of the state university system taught the philosophy of Georg Hegel, who I don't even want to call a Prussian philosopher. He is more a Prussian propagandist for Friedrich Wilhelm III in the 1800s, in which Hegel believed that the state was the march of God on earth, that the state decided what objective truth was, what science was, all of these things. Again, it's a living, in their minds and progressives thinking, the state is a living organism that subsumes everything. Corporations, individual rights, and it gives back any of those rights if it deems beneficial to the state, deems it beneficial to the state. So they're the ones that they think decide what is science, what is speech, what is information, misinformation, disinformation, what is correct. They think they decide, but this has always been the way that they have thought. It's in their DNA of the administrative state. And again, I think the shock to me was knowing all of this. How has this collapse of freedom not happened sooner? As you mentioned, how have we not really had this discussion before? And I think part of it's because a lot of presidents since Reagan have accepted the premise that this is legitimate. I worked in George W. Bush's White House as a writer. I would argue that George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush and every Democrat president since Reagan has accepted the premise that this is all legitimate. And their only problem with it is that they didn't actually run it. But they didn't have a problem with it until all of a sudden Donald J. Trump showed up, the great outsider, operating under, and I say this, there's a bit of an illusion that we've been a constitutional republic that kind of died a long time ago. In reality, because what's happened is obviously this administrative state over 100 years ago keeps on consolidating power and has become this massive, sprawling beast. And I just want to also say the administrative state, to me, people go, is this the deep state? is part of it. Administrative state has the deep state, the surveillance state. It has the regulatory state, which I think is a huge threat to our economic freedom and, quite frankly, our national security. A overactive regulatory state drives things offshore that I think calls into question some national security issues. And then you've got the retired in place, the DMV state, where you have 800,000 non-essential federal employees kind of retired in place. And so now you've got this whole situation where a lot of the governance has been actually given to these unelected bureaucrats. And Donald Trump shows up and goes, "We're a republic, right?" And they're like, "No, not so much. We haven't been for decades. And this is how we've operated. And the fact that you refuse to accept us as legitimate and reject the premise, you are an existential threat to status quo and to our future. That's why everything has happened. And that's why everything continues to happen." And they scream that he's an existential threat to democracy. No, he's an existential threat to their administrative state, which is deeply undemocratic.
Something you talk about in the book, which jives with what you're talking about now, this idea of this unelected, educated elites and the university system. You know, I studied diplomacy in Geneva. I taught at the top globalist MIT of Mexico, the Tec de Monterrey, where, you know, Bill Gates would speak at the graduation speeches. Hillary Clinton one year, I think, during the COVID. Al Gore has visited the campus. And, you know, some of my former students, I see photos of them now on LinkedIn, rubbing elbows with Trudeau. They're working for the American State Department, the Mexican, the Canadian. And I tried to warn these kids, but they don't care. They like that prestige that comes you know, with the position, the pay. They are yes men and yes women, cogs in the machine, content to have, you know, to push forward the will of this machine. And you talk about this in your book. And I think this is one of the biggest problems, that we have so many people willing to be cogs in the machine.
Power and influence are intoxicating drugs. And unless you have firmly in place what you believe in your values and principles, this whole system conforms you to its own image. And my dad was in the U.S. House for 10 years. And I still remember him saying, you know, just through that experience, that if you do not have your values and your principles in place and actually firmly believe, you know, what's right, what's wrong, this system is so powerful that eventually, unless you're an incredibly strong individual and deeply principled, it will conform you to its image. And so you see a lot of Republicans. So you see Democrats, you see a lot of establishment Republicans, a lot of people inside of DC that have accepted the premise. And I make the argument too in the book, I allude to it. Again, when you have an administrative state filled with unelected bureaucrats who are actually doing the governing, you gave up on representative democracy a long time ago. And just to clearly state for those listening, in a republic, all power flows from the people. And they then give to their duly elected representatives the power and money to create a government of, by, and for the people that actually every day promotes and protects the interests of the American people. The American people are first and last in all things. And in this form of government, I would argue what we are experiencing today, if they are even an afterthought, the American people are treated as the ATMs of this administrative state to fund their priorities, not the priorities of the American people. And again, that's another great sin of Donald J. Trump. Him showing up and saying, I believe we should have a government that actually benefits the American people. And again, like I just said, promotes and protects their interests on everything, whether it's immigration, whether it's trade, you name it. And again, treated as an enemy to his country, when in fact, all he wants to do is see a return, a restoration of a republic and a government of, by, and for the people.
And this, you know, Leviathan, I know your book focuses obviously on the United States, but it's
everywhere.
It's everywhere now. You know, I'm here in Mexico, became a proud Mexican national, but Mexico was modeled on the Republic of the U.S. and all of these revolutions of the 1700s and 1800s. And you see it here in Mexico. I'm also a Croatian national. I read in Croatia, we didn't have a property tax at all until recently, you know, and I knew it was going to come. And literally like 1 or 2 weeks ago, they introduced property tax, but they said only for property owners who rent. If you live in your home, You don't have to pay property tax, but as you know, as you depict in your book, pretty soon they're gonna make it. Everyone's gonna have to pay property tax. It's gonna be very low, and and then it's gonna spiral out of control. You talk about in your book the rapid succession of the progressives. From the 19 teens, how they passed the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th amendments, the income tax, and how it just grew out of control. And you talk about modern day Babel. The state is salvation. Hegel, you mentioned that already. And for progressive statists, you say the agenda of history is the apotheosis of man, turning man into God. And now we have transhumanism. I guess that's the next stage of this. So your further thoughts.
Yeah, no. So people need to understand it's almost a religious test for progressives. Don't you want salvation? People are like, well, of course. Well, then the state must be funded. That's why you're seeing 87,000 new IRS agents who are going to hoover up those $600 PayPal transactions. Because if the state is salvation, the state must be funded. And if you don't fund the state, you clearly don't want salvation. And even more so, this is why I say they vehemently rejected a rights-based government. And again, the preamble of the Declaration lays that out: inalienable rights given to you by a creator, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. You can't have that in an administrative state. You can't have a rights-based government because, for a whole host of reasons, first of all, they think the state subsumes all those and gives them back if it deems it beneficial. But you can't have all of these individuals making claims against the government saying, hey, that's unconstitutional. You're taking away my natural inherent rights. Because that would throw a monkey wrench in the cogs of the machine that's supposedly leading to progress. And so they very vehemently rejected the idea that government was there to secure rights. They viewed government as the giver of rights and giving you back rights if it was beneficial. So you look at all of this and realize the clash of two very different governing philosophies is another aspect of what's taking place between Donald J. Trump and DC. Who decides? A republic, and then also those governing philosophies: a republic versus administrative state. They're like oil and water. They will never mix. They can never mix. And at some point, one has to give way to the other. And I really think the reason I wanted this book to come out, people ask, where's the hardback edition? The publisher said, we'll do the hardback in January of 2025. I was like, please don't do that. I'd like a paperback so that people can understand what I think is one of the most important issues in 2024 is the administrative state. So that's why it's paperback and Kindle right now, maybe a hardback later. But I want people to understand one of the key issues for the 2024 elections here in the United States is what are we going to do with this administrative state? If Donald J. Trump, when he wins, please God, comes in to the White House January 2025, he would be the head of the executive branch. Most of this administrative state resides inside the Article 2 executive branch. Head of the executive branch, again, is the president. Has to be addressed, and you need somebody who says, I reject the premise. I have the political courage to actually do this. And so I lay out in that last chapter the steps, some of them, that I think are necessary to go, we're going to devolve and dismantle this state. We cannot continue down this path if we're actually going to have a government of, by, and for the people.
He's got a Kennedy helping him, so that's
isn't that one of the craziest things? Really quick, we get all the Kennedy Democrats, and they have all the Bush Republicans, and I'll take that trade any day.
Yeah, I saw that news. 700 plus, I think, security officials will be backing Kamala. Unscientific American, as I call it now, backing Kamala. They shouldn't be chiming in on that. They're supposed to remain neutral and scientific. And the
state protects its own. The state protects its own. It does. That's all that's about.
You also brought up in your book eugenics, which I think is important, and you mentioned the Nazis who began to look to American progressive laws on race. Yep. And some years back, I interviewed the renowned Jewish historian Edwin Black. I'm a huge fan of his work, and I was shocked. In his work, you learned that the Nazi regime was actually looking to the early 1900s America, the oligarchs of America, the Carnegies, the Fords, the Rockefellers. The first gas chamber was in America. You had American governors in the 1920s and 30s attempting to create concentration camps to exterminate undesirables. I mean, this was first here.
So understand, again, if the state is a living organism, you cannot have parasites inside of that living state that they think are not beneficial to the state. Okay, so that's, again, their thinking. So it's kind of this cyclical thing where Hegel's rational state leading to progress, the living organism, you have to reject the parasites. They were deeply bigoted and racist, by the way, the early progressives, including Theodore Roosevelt. John Burgess, who is considered the father of political science here in America, deeply racist and bigoted, also vehemently rejected a rights-based government, which I think calls into question the entire discipline of political science here in the US. So they go down this path, this pseudo-intellectual thinking that leads them to the pseudoscience of eugenics, that somehow the Negro race and the Jewish race and all of these are inferior races. And so out of that become progressive race laws. Out of those progressive race laws, you have Nazi lawyers in the 1930s looking at the progressive race laws, going, oh, yeah, that lays a pretty good foundation for what we want to accomplish here. And I don't even want to say to their credit, I kind of allude to this. A lot of American progressives realize if you are going to go down this race, down this path of purifying the race, it will eventually lead to having to have a final solution to what they considered inferior races, and they couldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. Not so much with the Nazis, but I tell people, in the book, when they started looking at race laws, they were looking at progressive race laws to justify what they were doing, and they were more than happy to take it to its eventual end. So when people feel all self-righteous about some of this stuff, yeah, progressivism, inspired by Hegel, finds its final conclusion with the Nazis. It's something that was really brought to my attention by Michael Crichton, and I quote him in American Leviathan, which he was talking about global warming and the pseudoscience of that, which goes back to, and then he started talking about eugenics. I'm like, oh, this is beautiful. I've got to include this in the book.
Yeah, that's a famous quote I love from Crichton, and you say in your book as well that it could get far worse if history is to be our guide at some. And then you're talking there about the eugenics, and then later you talk about the out of control DOJ, FBI. I had J. Michael Waller, who wrote Big Intel, on the podcast, and Amazon actually is the first time in my life, I think that was earlier this year, they rejected my book review of his book and warned me that if I did it again, I could be banned from the Amazon community. Just for leaving, it's absolutely insane. And so, I honestly think people should not have this false idea that we can't go there. This is a timeless idea. It's happened in Soviet Union, Russia, in China, in many European countries. And I think something like that has the potential to happen here in America. And so you talk also about the uniparty today. We've basically got a uniparty, and you also say nothing else matters until the administrative state, the deep state, the surveillance state are forcefully confronted and dismantled. Everything else is pointless. You say most would prefer to be left alone, to live in peace, raise their families, worship God, pursue their talents. And I totally agree with that. So you also said we must respond. We will give you all the disruption you want. I think this is what we need to do, is disrupt. I love that particular word. And so how do we beat Babylon back? How do we cut the Leviathan beast down and return to a time where we can, enjoy life without the interference of...
So the pernicious progressives insist that we submit to them because they are the oracles of the state. They are oracles of enlightenment. And they're only trying to bring salvation to us, the dirty little peasants. And what they view as disruptive is us saying we want a restoration of our rights, which kind of goes back to, I don't call it the American Revolution, I call it the American Restoration, in which Englishmen on this side of the Atlantic in the 1760s and early 1770s were telling Englishmen on the other side, we just want our rights as Englishmen restored, the rights that were assented to by kings and parliament, our God-given natural rights that no earthly power gave us, no earthly power can take away. And the British Empire, the ruling class of that empire, which viewed themselves as the best and the brightest and the most erudite, looked at the Englishmen on this side of the Atlantic and said, you're a sinkhole of prejudice and hatred, clinging to your old ways of covenants and constitutions. You will do what we say or else. And of course, leads to this, 8 years of fighting. Now what is taking place is American people are saying, we would like our rights restored. We would like our republic restored. We want all of these things that we used to have restored. And because of us saying that, because of us saying we don't accept the legitimacy of this administrative state, we are considered disruptive. And one of the points in me writing this book, one of the hopes, was that more of the American people would understand the reality of what is. I've been in the DC area about 25 years, and watching what's taking place, going, this has most days you go, this has nothing to do with a republic. Our elected officials have ceded a lot of their legislative authority to the unelected bureaucrats. The bureaucrats have then consolidated not only legislative but judicial power. And again, it goes back to this consolidated power, which is what progressives always envision. Has nothing to do with the republic. I would argue has really nothing to do with the American tradition of government. And here we find ourselves saying, hey, point of order, we'd just like to have a restoration. And because of us saying that, we're treated as enemies and as threats. But I will say this, there should be hope. Again, head of the executive branch is over most of the administrative state. Donald Trump can take huge steps in the right direction. I lay that in the last chapter. The Supreme Court this summer, they made two very important decisions, one of which I write about. They rejected Chevron deference, which was where for 40 years, judges would defer to the statutes and regulations of the unelected bureaucrats. They said, we're not doing that anymore. We've rejected it. In many ways, Chevron deference had kind of been left behind anyway, but they wanted to put a point on and say, we reject this firmly. We will no longer have judicial deference to Chevron deference. The other thing that people weren't paying attention to, and I wish I'd written about it, but I'm going to talk about it with you right now, is they said the SEC tribunals are unconstitutional. And the Securities and Exchange Commission has an administrative law tribunal that is judge, jury, and executioner, in which 90% of the time they rule in favor of the SEC. And a lot of departments and agencies have these administrative law tribunals that shockingly, like overwhelming majority of the time, rule in favor of that department or agency. And the Supreme Court said, we're not going to accept that anymore because our founders believe that you should have an independent judiciary. And that was one of the reasons that they fought for their restoration of their rights, because they felt the British courts were rubber stamping King George III's edicts, Parliament's edicts, King George's ministers' edicts was not an independent judiciary, was not a counterbalance to that power. So the founders like, we're going to have an independent judiciary that will not rubber stamp, will be actually offset the power, again, diffusion of power. And so the Supreme Court said, we're not going to accept these tribunals as constitutional anymore. Also, the fact that you have a private tribunal annihilates the Seventh Amendment. Again, a Bill of Rights, which right to trial by jury, which is part of our Bill of Rights, which goes back to my original point. A Bill of Rights is just a parchment barrier, right? At the end of the day, it's just a enumerated list of rights that, in theory, government's not supposed to take away. But the greatest protector of our natural inherent rights is the diffusion of power, because when power is diffused, it cannot be consolidated to abuse your rights. And yet progressives, in their deeply, dangerously naive thinking, were like, no, we're going to consolidate power to advance progress. You eventually get to that unelected, unaccountable, consolidated power, and you end up with authoritarian dictators saying you have to do this because we say so. It has nothing to do with the U.S. Constitution.
And it's kind of, this week, this is a whole other subject, but the United Abominations, as I like to call them, is meeting for the Pact of the Future to attempt to shore up world administrative state. And they've been failing for a long time, but we'll see what happens there. Very much enjoyed your book and
thank you.
Recommend it. Your links are in the description. Any final thought, and if you want to mention any other projects or best place to get the book and so forth.
Grab it at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, basically wherever books are sold, you can find a copy of it. Give it a review. It's one of those things where I would really like people to read it and review it at Amazon, just because the left always seems to want to go after my books, especially Restoring Our Republic, which lays out how the founders built the machinery of the Republic. So grab a copy, read it, review it. Would really appreciate that. You can find out more at Ned Ryun, NEDRYU on X. I want to call it Twitter still, but X. I run American Majority, AmericanMajority.org, and we're doing a lot of good work in the field right now with our C4 because I believe politics is policy. You have to have the political power to implement some of these reform items. We have to win politically before you can implement the right policy. And I love to write and I love to commentate, but most of my work is about how do you have meaningful, purposeful action to bring about the restoration.
I will attempt to leave you an Amazon book review. Again, the book is American Leviathan: The Birth of the Administrative State and Progressive Authoritarianism. Keep up the great work, Mr. Ryun.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Appreciate it.